This is episode 9 of Store and Forward, a podcast about the past and future of amateur radio. I am Kay Savitz, K6KJN. I am the curator of the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, your free online ham radio library brought to you by the Internet Archive. And I am here with my lovely and talented co-host,
Steve Stroh, NHGNJ, and I am the editor of the Zero Retries newsletter.
and today is December 8th, 2024, and we are here to talk about fun things in ham radio.
The past and future of amateur radio.
What about the present, Steve? Who's covering the present?
Oh, that's true. Good point. Well, I think that's a joint effort.
Yeah, maybe that's some other podcast. I don't know. Yeah, so let's see. I guess I'll start a little bit. Happy December to you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have been, see, the Internet Archive is now 95% back to normal after the problem, the hack that happened in October. The folks have been spinning up the all the tools and rejiggering things so things are more secure. And I think that at this point, the vast majority of people who go to Internet Archive now are going to get what they need and not realize, there's going to be nothing amiss for them. And there's folks that have special needs, very special niche things that they might not have all the tools yet. But so anyway, it's things are getting back to normal. And
I was
I've been,
glad.
go ahead.
I was glad to see stuff is flowing into DLARC again. I'm on the RSS feed, so I see stuff coming in now.
Yes, it's great to be able to add stuff again. I was growing this backlog of things that, well, I'll get to that later. So, yeah, and some of the things, let's see, talk about some of the things that we've been able to add. I just added 600 and something episodes of a Japanese radio show about ham radio. And oddly, it is called Ham's Radio, and it is broadcasted from Radio Narita outside Tokyo on a community radio station, kind of a what we would call an LPFM station. And these guys have been doing this podcast, this radio show for years and years, all about ham radio, and it's mostly in Japanese. And I learned about it from Cale Muth's Ham Radio Weekly newsletter, which I love. And I reached out to the gentleman who runs this radio show, the producer, whose name is also Kay. And he's like, "Yeah, archive it." And so I did. It was a special challenge because I don't speak or read Japanese, so I had to use a lot of Google Translate and other tools to like just figure out what I was looking at. And Kay sent me all of the episodes in MP3 format, which was great. But then he didn't send me
The metadata?
the metadata. The show notes are just like on a blog. So I created some custom scripts to go scrape all that from the blog, which is interesting because there's show notes in the blog, but also just like other things about the radio station and whatever. So I had to first find out which ones are the show notes and then make a list of those and then download all those, and made some scripts to get that metadata, correlate it with the show's episodes. Now, fun. Archiving is fun. I'm having fun. The show notes, the show's MP3 files were all dated with the air date, which is great. But then the metadata blog posts were sometimes posted on the air date and sometimes a day earlier and sometimes a day later. So more scripting to find the nearest episode. Anyway, so I got all those uploaded and they were there, and then I made sure everything was run through um, Whisper transcription, which I'm again I don't speak or read Japanese, but I'm given to understand Whisper does a fine job with Japanese. So we transcribed all those episodes and made them full text searchable. And then after doing all this work, I'm just like, I I don't really I'm missing out. The English speaking American, I don't know what I just archived really. So then I made some new code to take all of the Japanese show notes and feed them to uh, ChatGPT's API and translate them all into English and add those as a note. So it's like, here's it says like literally here's a machine translation of the show notes. And then all of a sudden I'm looking at, oh, they're talking about Dayton Hamvention, and they're talking about the some anniversary of the Japanese version of CQ magazine, and they're talking about all these interesting things. And uh, um, running just as side note, running all of the 600 and something episodes show notes through the paid uh, 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 OpenAI API to translate cost me 16 cents to get all that work done.
Oh, I just can't wait for another year, maybe two, at this pace when we're going to have essentially real-time translation.
Mhm.
And you're going to be able to say, I want to listen to this, and I want it to be translated into English for my poor ears. And something I'm constantly astonished at with the Japanese is that in my dealings with typical Japanese hams, they seem very embarrassed by their English skills, and they're completely graceful about that in comparison to my having zero Japanese skills. So their English is far, far better than my Japanese, and I have no trouble understanding them. And, but they're still, I, I'd rather not. So I get it. So, but fortunately, technology, I mean, man, I remember when we used to have islands of email, and now we've got universal email, and this is just going to be one more barrier to fall to me as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, and in fact, there's an interesting correlation here. There's a project going on that's part of FreeDV that is incorporating machine language, and I couldn't quite figure. They're doing an interesting project where they're adding machine language into an FM channel and essentially just basically making it um, digital voice instead of analog FM voice.
Mhm.
And I couldn't figure out why they were putting the ML into it, but then somebody just dropped in this brief little mention. Once you've got ML, you can have simultaneous translation. And I was thinking, oh man, this is getting really powerful. This is, I mean, and this is ham radio. I mean, we can do this now in small. You got help. Um, we can do this in small systems like Raspberry Pi 5, and for $100 worth of compute power. So it's. In fact, well, we'll talk about it in a little bit. What I'm seeing. So anyway, that's cool. And I see on the show notes that you also have some Russian material.
Yes. Speaking of ML, machine translation, recently added a bunch of translations of Russian amateur radio publications that were not translated by machine, but were translated by one very industrious, dedicated human over the course of decades. Um, this gentleman named Dexter Anderson, K3KWJ, uh, for many years from the 80s to the 2000s, I think, this was subscribing to Russian publications, including an amateur radio publication and just like a general newspaper, and translating, summary translating the articles about ham radio into English and distributing among his friends, a few hams, DXers, and stuff. So these aren't like word for word translations of the articles. He read the articles. He's in Russian. He summarized them into English, and gave us the nut of what they were about. And it's just amazing, this amazing body of work that went on from, let me see what the dates are here. Um, the 2000 is the latest one, the earliest one, 1974. And so he was reading, these magazines and newspapers and translating them and providing this, I don't know, what I think is amazing glimpse of Cold War era and post Cold War era Russian radio. Now, I had written about this a little bit for Zero Retries in my most recent column. And since then, the Scanning Center sent me a whole bunch more. There's like another 30 or 40 issues have shown up.
Wow.
I don't always have real insight into, they're doing their work, I'm doing my work, and sudden, oh, look, more things showed up. So I thought they were done, and all of a sudden more things showed up. Um, I wanted to point out, as I wanted to talk about, I wanted to give you something interesting, just here's a specific example of something I found that was interesting. And every time I try to do that with this set of work, it's like the first thing I look at. It's like, oh, this is interesting. I don't have to dig very far. So I found this thing that Dexter translated from August 1989 from the Soviet amateur magazine Radio. And um, he says, in the USSR, the term radio Lubaitel, uh, literally radio amateur, has a far broader meaning than in most other countries. People considered radio amateurs in the USSR may be divided into the following categories, rank ordered by the immediacy of their use of radio frequency spectrum and the relationship between activity and radio. One, an elite of roughly 100,000 transmitting radio amateurs, some 50,000 with their own call signs and 50,000 others, perhaps without personal call signs, but with permission to transmit from collective stations. I'm thinking like club stations or something. Um, an unknown number, an unknown number of observers, SWLs, shortwave listeners, some with FWL call signs and some without, whose officially recognized activity, incidentally, is limited to the monitoring of amateur stations. Observers are passive or one-way users of the radio frequency spectrum. Three, an unknown number of fox hunters and other radio sportsmen who are also passive or one-way users of the radio spectrum. And thought this was interesting. Four, an unknown number of speed copiers of Morse code whose activity doesn't involve even passive use of the radio frequency spectrum, but does involve a relationship to radio because of the use of Morse code for radio communication. So I don't know. I just thought it was interesting that like many of the people on the radio in Russia at this time most of them weren't actually transmitting. They were listening.
That's interesting because I've always I have never adhered to a very strict definition of amateur, or at least coverage of amateur, licensed amateur radio operators. What I call it is amateur radio adjacent, and I consider things like using unlicensed spectrum, like LoRa and Meshtastic, I consider that amateur radio adjacent. There's also a project called SatNogs, Satellite Networked Open Source Ground Station.
Okay.
Um,
I don't know that one. I've never heard you mention that one before, so that's new to
oh,
me.
oh, okay. Um,
Say it again. Satellite networked open source ground station.
right.
Rolls
So,
right off the tongue.
well, your friends at Portland State University will be soon launching, or not launching, but constructing and then arranging for launch of a research satellite by just for educational purposes. And the problem with all these research satellites that are put up by small organizations like colleges is that they're the ones that are motivated to receive the signals from this. And in a research satellite, unless you can get the data back, it doesn't do a lot of good. I mean, you get it up. So when the satellite happens to pass within the receiving range of Portland State University, then they can get the data. But every place else on the planet, the data is lost. Enter SatNogs, which is a project that came out of Spain, which is cool. It says, here's how you construct a receive-only ground station for being able to receive these things. And originally it was pretty ambitious that they came out with 3D printing CAD files for gears, so be able to actively move an antenna to track the satellite as it goes across the horizon. But now there are things like what are called egg beater antennas, which listen up instead of, so a vertical antenna listens omnidirectionally to, horizontally. An egg beater does the same thing, but vertically. So you can get reasonable signals. So a SatNOG station consists of a antenna, a software-defined receiver, which can be as little as $35 or as expensive as $100 or $150. A computer, it doesn't have to be a Raspberry Pi, but that's ideal, and then an internet connection. And what happens is you say what you're interested in doing, or let the SatNOGs project assign it to you, and say, and you tell it where you are in the world and says, okay, so these satellites are going to be passing over, or this is the greatest need, or whatever. As the satellite passes over, it's constantly broadcasting its telemetry, it's downlinking it. Your station receives it. It processes it minimally on the system. It separates it out into audio and data, caches that, sends that, and then optionally, if you have a unlimited internet connection, you can then send the IQ, what's called the IQ data, which is the really heavy duty files, which they can run the really heavy duty signal processing on. And you do this continually. It just sits there and works. It doesn't interfere with anything you do. It's like a public service, much like receivers for airlines and ships and things like that. It's just a passive receiver that contributes to a network. And so I'm just illustrating this as an activity that isn't amateur radio. It doesn't have to be amateur radio, even though a lot of these satellites are transmitting on amateur frequencies. To receive amateur radio, you don't need a license. So you can build this as like a STEM project or a makerspace project or something like that. And you're contributing to space science because of this, because every satellite that goes up has to have some kind of amateur radio mission, but colleges aren't that, what's the word, progressive. You can get a non-amateur radio frequency for coordinated, but it's hard. Amateur radio frequencies are easy as long as it does something interesting for amateur radio, like being a repeater or a digipeater or something like that. So there's the science mission and there's the amateur radio mission on most of these. And, SatNOGs is focused on the science mission of all these satellites. And some of them measure gravity fluctuations or ionosphere or, a gazillion things that they can measure. My favorite example of science on an amateur radio satellite was AMSAT launched a satellite that happened to have a GPS receiver, and I think it was going to fly it was an elliptical orbit or a wide, or oh, it was going to be a wide area orbit, like anyway, it was going to be an orbit that was above the GPS satellites. And AMSAT went to the Air Force and said, "Could you tell us what, we're going to launch this mission, and we're curious what your emissions are on the backside of your GPS satellites." And they said, "Well, that's classified, and we can't tell you, but we'd love for you to share the data with us." so, so
Hmm.
that was cool. So, amateur radio does really interesting things. And I just mentioned in this week's issue of Zero Retries that the HAMSA, Amateur Radio Science Citizen Investigation Conference, is going to be in March.
Hmm. HAMSI.
Yep. And they do serious science using amateur radio, and they get students involved, and it is amazing. So I'm just looking forward to that. I don't think I'll be going cross country to attend that one, but maybe in 2026. But I sure wanted to highlight it in Zero Retries. So sorry to sidetrack that conversation, but
No,
yeah.
that's
I mean,
awesome.
so I'm just saying that to illustrate that just like in Russia, I don't make a hard distinction between amateur radio. Yes, there's the licensing issue, but in my coverage of radio experimentation, I like to go further abroad than what the the hard definition of amateur radio is. And there's some really amazing stuff going on. Just like what Meshtastic is doing, there's other experimentation going on. Um, there's even satellites that are using unlicensed spectrum to transmit their data using LoRa modulation, which is very robust. It's a specific form of spread spectrum, very robust, low data rate, but very robust. So there's a lot of stuff going on that you don't have to have an amateur radio license for, and they're doing interesting things, and so I try to report them on it. So
Nice.
and
Nifty.
so that I think that segues into something I've been working on, and it ties nicely between our two areas of focus. Um, I mentioned a while ago, well, in the article that I wrote for the Internet Archive blog about how valuable I found DLARC to be, is an article that I remember this vaguely, and I dug it up and mentioned it in passing in the article about a type of satellite called a PACSat, and short for packet satellite. And what this thing did is that it flew over, and you could uplink a packet radio message, email essentially, to the satellite as it was passing overhead for you. And then in another area of the world, the message would be downlinked or it would broadcast and say, G7XYZ, we have a message for you. And then G7XYZ would transmit to the satellite, and it would downlink the message. It was a flying,
A store and forward DigiPeater that's real far away.
right. And it's a flying mailbox,
Hmm.
essentially, was what it was. And that was real. It was there. That was some really groundbreaking technology for the era. They had to figure out robust modulation methods. They figured out that because the pass was so short, having one uplink channel was just a non-starter, because it would be constantly jammed. Everybody would be trying to access that one channel. So they said 4 channels. They figured out how to queue it up between those 4 inputs to one output, etc. So that apparently that started a background task in my head. I thought, why don't we do this now? Because we did it back then when it was hard. Every bit of that technology was custom. The hardware was custom made. The software was, it was firmware running on obscure processors. And now we have this incredible processing power. We have universal receivers. So for example, doing that four input channel thing is now a software defined receiver dongle, and a Raspberry Pi, literally, and a piece of software, a unique piece of software now that is nobody else in the world would have thought to do, called K9Q radio. And this software takes this standard receiver, off-the-shelf receiver, off-the-shelf computer, and it turns it into this universal radio that can simultaneously listen to every channel on one of our VHF or UHF bands. All of the channels, all of the time. And so, for example, if we wanted to replicate this PACSAT technology, and we wanted to have, say, we wanted to have a channel for 1200 baud users, we wanted a channel for 9600 baud users, we wanted a channel for 3600 baud users, some with forward error correction, some with not, etc. We can do all that now, and it's one receiver, it's one computer, and we can have all these, and then we'd have to replicate this this contention mechanism. But here's the beauty of this, is that all of this was described in papers over the years. And I got the statistics here. Excuse me just a minute. Oh, where'd it go? Oh, so there were 11 conference papers developed about PACSAT, 9 newsletter articles in the Tapper Packet Status Register, and even a book, the PACSAT Beginner's Guide. So all of the hard work about all this stuff was done back when it was hard to do with computers, hard to do with radios, hard to do with signal processing. And so we now have the technology, and we should be doing something with it. So, and I got all of that information out of DLARC because it was all in one place. I've got actually a shelf full of the Digital Communications Conference proceedings, which are basically nice decoration on my shelf, because I can't, there's no reason to donate them to DLARC because, you have it all already. I just like having it, but I don't sit there and read it. But if I can do a keyword search on DLARC and find PACSAT, I found all this stuff, within seconds. So that's the beauty of DLARC, is that there's this stuff. And now, so what this has triggered for me is this idea of what I'm starting to call a SuperPeater, meaning a device that sits on a high hill that listens to one frequency, transmits on another frequency, does this one thing, either FM voice or digital voice, and that's all it does. And if you're not using it for that, it just sits there doing nothing, and worse, it ties up a particular frequency in our precious 2-meter band doing nothing, because the frequency belongs to the repeater. It doesn't truly, but I'm not going to get into that particular sticky wicket. So the idea of the possibilities of a better way to do things, in my opinion, about repeaters, came directly out of DLARC. And that's the beauty of this collaboration that you and I have accidentally developed, because you're doing things. Your focus is very wide about amateur radio in general. Mine is pretty narrow in comparison to the data systems. But my gosh, there's so much data in there. Some of it donated by me, but a lot that it wasn't. And it's just a fantastic resource. And it never occurred to me to offer this analogy, but there's this tired old phrase: those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And I'll offer an allegory for amateur radio. Those who don't know what we've done before are doomed to recreate it. So the hard way. So like in this pack set, I'm going to dive into those. I'm going to dive into those papers. They described modulation techniques that they said you literally had to build a hardware modem out of discrete components and individual ICs, and now we've got
Right.
these very fast digital
Right. You could do it with a 20 line Python script and
and an off the shelf digital analog to digital converter, you know.
yeah.
And Phil, I was actually talking to Phil Karn. I said one of these when we were initially anticipating doing high speed data over the air, we went from having to have this particular kind of controller called a high level data link controller. It was a special piece of hardware that I think was previously only used in floppy disks or something like that. Then we moved to direct memory access controllers that would, you know, move blocks of data inside the computer. And now we just use serial ports and bit banging. You know, we just pull that port, you know, so many, because we can. It's cheap, it's easy, it's off the shelf. And so now we've got so much technology that we're not using yet, you know, we could be doing. And what I'm the thrust of zero retries is to try to bring the techies into amateur radio, showing them this very, very rich tool set that we have and say, hey, you want to play with radio? Come here, go, you know, look at what we've done. Think of things that you want to do. There's plenty of room, you know, and now that we are becoming a community of experimenters, there's any individual technology that you can imagine has some kind of special interest group. I'm kind of trying to cluster the digital experimenters into zero retries. And there's now 2,300 direct email subscribers. There's hundreds more that are following along from other mechanisms. So, you know, we're really onto something, I think. And so, sorry, running out of steam on that one.
No, it's real exciting. And yeah, I, I have I don't think I have much to add other than yes. Um, um, yeah, it's fun to see the ideas that you're coming up with. And I'm happy that the information I'm finding and putting in DLARC is helping you to in your research.
I, you know, in a very, very small way, I was doing my own version of DLARC that I had been archiving stuff that I found, you know, or I wasn't, I was collecting it. I wasn't archiving it. And when DLARC came along and you were named as the curator, you know, and you were so accommodating about bringing stuff in and, you know, and it was so fantastic. It was absolute dream of, you know, that the stuff that had been sitting on my shelf as paper and in file cabinets and in boxes is now actually on DLARC, available for anyone to read, and better, you know, it's available to quote, you know, and extract. And some of these folks are long gone, you know, and the guy that created the first high speed modem for amateur radio, WA4DSY, is you know, long gone now, and you know we still haven't risen. In a lot of ways, we have not risen to what he was able to create, um, and we should. So. And then another interesting thing about zero retries is that I never know what's going to um, resonate with the readers. So, for example, I put a lot of work into this, uh, uh, a long article about the early stages of this SuperPeater idea, and that's been almost completely ignored in favor of a brief mention of that the ARRL quoted in their 2023 annual report that 75% of newly licensed technician licensees are inactive after 1 year. And oh boy, that's the thing that everybody latched onto. And I've gotten several comment stories about how that how could they possibly know? Especially those of us who aren't amateur radio or ARRL members, or that tracked off into activities within our technician license. I specifically named that I've talked to several folks who got their technician license solely to experiment with amateur radio microwave networks. And that's so far off the radar of anything that ARRL is paying attention
Sure.
to these
And they
days.
they might be doing that in their basement or shack or whatever, setting up their little thing, playing with one another friend, and they don't go to club meetings and they don't sign up for the ARRL and they don't need to. They're doing their thing, they're having fun and whatever. But right. Is that inactive according
Yeah,
to
exactly.
yeah.
The only two things I could think of that the ARRL would be able to track is that people didn't join the ARRL and people did not progress, which I still have a major issue with that terminology, progress to their general or their extra license. But they've cited this twice now, one by the ARRL president in this report, and then an earlier column by this ARRL CEO in QST. And they've never, that I've seen, never made this study public, never mentioned what their methodology was, etc. So I'm suspicious. I'm not dismissing the idea out of hand. It certainly, if they're even half right, it certainly points to an issue, as I said in the Zero Retrace, the issue of amateur radio in the near future. But I don't know. So I do my part to stir up interest in amateur radio, at least the parts that I find interesting, that I can generate real enthusiasm for.
Yeah.
So,
Excellent.
yeah.
And yeah, and there's people out there doing their newsletters on old school radios and Morse code and the traditional side of amateur radio. So there's something for everybody.
Yeah, a real good example of that is an issue that I believe you regularly archive on DLARC, is a nice little newsletter called Hot Iron.
Yeah.
And I mentioned their latest issue in Zero Retries, and the focus of this latest issue of Hot Iron was vacuum tube power amplifiers. And as I said in Zero Retries, I have a non-aggression policy from long standing about vacuum tube circuits, having not done it well when I was a youth. So I said solid state is more my style. So, but they have a very rabid audience. Another niche interest is amateur television, which is
Right.
actually doing very well. I have a minor quibble with them, creating repeaters that are essentially digital or data repeaters, but the formatting is, television, video. And I gently took that up with the editor of this newsletter, which is now called Amateur Television News. And he fired back and said, "Well, there's like a data subsystem in this. If you wanted to tunnel data over an ATV repeater, no problem." He said, "Yeah, you got a point. There's more ATV repeaters than there are dedicated
Right.
data repeaters."
It's like, do you want to put your codec in my codec, or should I put my codec in your codec?
That's exactly, yes. So, I really think that if we actually apply some work to this, we can come up with these data repeaters that can pass video and audio. I I can literally imagine the very very distilled version of a SuperPeater to me is that it has one master output, say on 220 megahertz
Mhm.
or 222 megahertz, and you receive that with a software defined radio as an independent thing. And then there are many inputs to that system because it's so fast. I don't know. I'm guessing that the receiver could do as fast as 38,400 bits per second, or maybe some other. I don't know. But there would be many inputs into that data stream that could be multiplexed in. So if you're only interested in listening to the voice things, click that button. If you're interested in, getting your email, click that button, et cetera, or all of the above, and that would show some real technological innovation and activity in our amateur radio spectrum. It would, and the whole point of repeaters, I'm really trying to think of this from the perspective of somebody very new to this. Why do we need a repeater? What good is the repeater? And the answer is that it lets someone like you. I'm guessing that your wonderful. Are you in a homeowners association?
No, no, not.
Oh, okay. Well, then you could put up,
I
whatever
could
antenna you
do
want.
whatever I
But
want, paint my house pink and put up the world's tallest antenna. But yes, if I was an HOA, they would probably not want those things.
so you would be able to operate very effectively by using a hidden antenna, a VHF or UHF hidden antenna. In fact, you can hack up a satellite dish to work as a UHF antenna, um, and and be a full-fledged participant in such a data network because that repeater is doing the heavy lifting. It's on a. You have some amazing broadcast towers in Portland. You know, you're lousy with them, and hams are on most of those antennas. So
But
that's the re.
right, but plus that repeater could be doing other things we talked about before, like doing live translation
Yeah, absolutely.
of language as well as live translation between codecs or whatever. So yeah, frequencies change anything into any other thing
We're
in real time.
amateur radio is open source experimentation in the radio realm. And face it, folks, everything we do now is radio. If you're communicating, it's with somebody else, it's by radio, via Wi-Fi. We're doing this conversation via Starlink on my end, radio, Wi-Fi, cellular, Bluetooth.
Hmm.
I at the moment I'm hardwired into the Starlink modem, but I could be using my AirPods,
Sure.
etc. So, in fact, I'm 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 radiating RF with two devices that are strapped to my body right now. So, we're the more we know about radio technology, the better off we'll be. It's the steel of the 21st century. So, and I think amateur radio has a role to play, still has a role to play, and I'm beating the drum as hard as I can. So, and
Excellent.
thank you for providing the fuel from DLARC for a lot of what I'm doing.
Thank you. All right.
I think that's a wrap.
I think so. Um,
I hope you
Great. Well,
judiciously edit this down to our more listenable.
oh no, I'm way lazier than that. Um, but I will do the closing blurb if I can scroll to the right thing. This has been Store and Forward, your podcast about the past and future of amateur radio. I am K Savitz, K6KJN. Our address for this podcast is storeandforwardradio.org, where you will find the show notes for this and every episode, links to everything we've talked about, and oftentimes pretty picture or two. Um, I am the curator of the Digital Library of Amateur Radio and Communications, which you can find at archive.org/details/DLARC, which is an unparalleled library of amateur radio. We have newsletters from around the world, amateur radio podcasts, magazines, books, and things in
Videos.
Russian, videos, and also and new things in Russian and Japanese.
And I am Steve Stroh, NHENJ. I'm the editor of the Zero Retries newsletter, which is free to subscribe at www.zero retries, retries.org, and it publishes weekly, usually at 15:30 Pacific. Sometimes it runs a little late, but it's always published on Friday so far, and we're
And when
now in
it's late,
our
you know it's going to be real good. There's something juicy is going on.
thank you. Um, uh, so we've been going for 3.5 years now, and 2,300 email subscribers and many more followers along. So thanks again, Kay.
Thank you. 73.
73.